Okay, tonight we are talking about writing specifically for positive impact, to have a positive, concrete, favorable impact on your reader. The assignment for next week is a 2-page summary paper, and it is just a summary of what you find on the Greek word salo. That word, by the way, is typically spelled P-S-A-L-L-O, and it is the word used in James chapter 5, verse 13 to describe singing psalms. Use at least 3 linguistic references or resources. That would be a lexicon, Bible software, other Greek reference works. That is a Greek word, by the way. And try to use at least 3 Bible study resources. Now, we talked about various resources last week: linguistic resources, lexicons, Bible dictionaries, things like W.E. Vine, things of that sort. Bible study resources, commentaries, bulletin articles, magazine articles, historical references, things of that sort. Try to use 3 of each in this little 2-page article. Document your sources in a works cited section at the end of the paper. And you can consult the Modern Language Association standards online. Just look up MLA documentation, and that will give you the information you need. I will eventually probably email you the MLA handout that I had used until everything went online, and that's from the online writing laboratory at Purdue University, the OWL. So you'll have that in a PDF format. You can use that if you want to. This is for next week. Okay, now let's talk about non-standard, commonly misused expressions. These are things that in our regular speech might go unnoticed, other than in the pulpit, but in writing, to an astute reader, they will jump off the page. So, first, a comparison. The word beside compared to or versus the word besides. What's the difference between beside and besides? When they're used to express the idea of except, they mean the same thing. They're interchangeable. I own no other book except the Bible. I own no other book beside the Bible. I own no other book besides the Bible. Same meaning all the way around. Interchangeable. However, the word beside also means alongside of, next to something else. The shovel is beside the rake. That means it's right next to it. Besides, plural sounding, can also mean in addition to. They both mean except. Beside means next to something, alongside something. And besides means except or in addition to. I have 20 pencils besides my pen. So you have different nuances of meaning. So you wouldn't want to say the shovel is besides the rake. It sounds a little awkward because it is a little awkward. It doesn't actually mean next to. It means in addition to. Now you could say I have a shovel besides my rake. It's a little bit awkward because besides is sort of a plural sounding word, but it would be probably non-standard, but it would be vivid anyway. Moving on. The word bug really bugs me. A bug is an insect. but that's an informal word. It can refer to an insect, a germ, a defect. It can also be used as a verb. See, these are all nouns. It can also be used as a verb to express the idea of harass or irritate. The bug in this computer really bugs me. That would be the defect or the flaw. Really irritates. We could add that word here as well. So here you have a word that can go either way, but it's a non-standard. It's an informal word. It's also a slang term for somebody who's an enthusiast about something. A shutterbug, which is a word pretty well about to disappear out of common use because where's your camera now? Well, your camera doesn't have a shutter. It's in your phone. But in ancient times when we used mechanical cameras before digital came along, folks who like to take pictures were described as shutterbugs. So it's an informal, it's a slang word. It's not a bad word, but it's an informal word at best. Now, for what it's worth, that doesn't mean that it's a word you don't use in the pulpit. It's probably a word that you would not use in a church bulletin article, or certainly not in academic writing, unless maybe you were writing about a software defect, something of that sort, because it is an informal word. Now, in the pulpit, informal can be used for emphasis or for relationality, relatability, but it's not a good idea to use it routinely. Every day versus every day. What's the difference between every day and every day? Well, the first of these, when it's one word, every day, it means something that's common or routine, something that is humdrum. But when it's two separate words, every day, that means each succeeding day. Every day in the week means Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, properly beginning Sunday and ending on Saturday. You can have everyday occurrences that occur every day. Everyone and everyone are very similar. Everyone is a collective noun. It means all people. Everyone distinguishes each individual person there. You have something akin to this, and I think we mentioned this last week or the week before, in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, in Peter's words in Acts 2, verse 38. We read in verse 36, Peter concluding his sermon on the day of Pentecost, saying, "Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made him both Lord and Christ, this same Jesus whom ye crucified. And they were pricked in their hearts," that is, the people listening were pricked in their hearts, "and they cried out, saying, Men and brethren, what shall we do?" And what did Peter say? He didn't say, "Every one of you repent." And he didn't say, "Everyone repent." Not quite in that way. He said, "Repent ye," or "repent thee, all of you," a collective plural, second person collective plural. It's not used in modern English. In colloquial Southern speech, it would be, all y'all repent, and every one of you, each individual person, be baptized. So that's the distinction between everyone and everyone. And then there's this word, undoubtedly. Well, undoubtedly, thus and such and so and so. Undoubtedly is a non-standard form of undoubtedly. It's an incorrect formulation. In that respect, it's akin to ain't. Ain't is a slang contraction that mashes up two separate forms of the verb to be, are and is, with a negation, not. Ain't is like saying are is not. So these are just some things to sensitize yourself to. I don't have any great fear that anyone taking this class would routinely make the mistakes that we've described here. But being aware of things like these sensitizes you to similar non-standard and slang and misused phrases and terms. And that's good, because that will sharpen your writing skills. All right, let me erase all of this now, and then we'll talk about clarity of purpose in writing. And if you didn't get that written down and we're trying to, well, that's all right. You can go back and review the archive. And if you weren't writing it down, that's your business. But I will not guarantee you that some of these won't be on the test. All right. Writing for clarity of purpose. Clarity, we know what clarity means. Clarity means clearness, understandability, clarity of purpose. Well, what's the purpose? The hardest part of writing for many, many writers is figuring out what you want to say. Figuring out what you want to write about, what your subject is, that's a challenge. But once you've got your subject, what do you say about it? How do you introduce it? How do you launch into it? What do you want to bring out about it? What do you want to leave out about it? Where does it take you? And where will you end up? How do you get there? Most writers never figure out exactly where they're going in what they write, which is why most manuscripts submitted to publishers are rejected. It's interesting to learn that J.K. Rowling, I believe she may well be the wealthiest woman in the world now, the author of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and all the subsequent Harry Potter books and the screenplays and all the movies that were made from that have made her an exceedingly wealthy woman. But it's interesting to realize that her original manuscript, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, we call it the Sorcerer's Stone on this side of the Atlantic, was rejected by publisher after publisher. Now, That being said, if you've read the book, Rowling is actually a good writer. She's a sharp writer. Her grammar is it's very British, but her grammar is good. I'm getting a text from somebody. But, oh, okay. Never mind. Many writers never seem to discover what they actually want to say before they get to the end of whatever they're writing. Before you write the first word, think about what message you want your reader to get and how you plan to make it plain. Before you ever sit down pen in hand or sit down at the keyboard, what's the message? What's the point that I want the reader to get? If they take one thing and only one thing away from what I write, what's that one thing? Let's apply that for just a moment to Madame Rowling's first book. If you read Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, you read all about the somewhat unwelcome, neglected little boy living in the cupboard under the stairs, being brought into the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, or whatever it's called, and the adventures that he has there, and how he finds the philosophers, the Sorcerer's Stone, and the friendships that he makes, and the challenges that he faces and overcomes. What is the basic point that Madame Rowling makes with her story? Now, it's a fictional story. We don't typically write fiction as Bible students, gospel preachers, teachers. We're writing about fact. We're writing to persuade, not merely to entertain. And yet the principle holds true as much in our writing, or as much in her fictional writing, as it does in what we write. If you examine the whole story, start to finish, what's the ultimate outcome? It's a little bit like Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, written in the aftermath of the Civil War. It's a little bit like the plot of any Star Trek episode. It's a little bit like the ultimate message of the Revelation. In the end, despite all odds and opposition, good, or in her case, love, triumphs over evil. She figured that out somewhere in the course of writing that book, whether it was before or in the middle of it. She figured it out, and it shows. Before you write the first word, whether it's a sermon or a book or a chapter or an article, whether it's a school assignment or a love letter for that matter, before you write the first word, think about what message you want your reader to receive. And then think about how you plan to make it plain. Now, it often helps to outline those ideas first, and we'll come to that in a moment. Clarity of purpose, writing to have a positive impact, means writing with clarity. Writing with clarity means, number one, writing clearly formed thoughts. If you haven't really thought about what you're going to write, I can promise you'll ramble. And if you ramble, unless you are an exceptionally vivid writer, anybody who tries to read what you write will quit before they get to the end because you're just rambling. So, writing to have a positive impact means writing with clarity. It means having clearly formed thoughts. It means expressing those thoughts. In or with clear, accurate, understandable words. By the way, understandable often translates to simple words. And it means rewording. Writing well means planning what you write. Plan what you write. Read what you have written and rewrite what you wrote. Why would you rewrite it? Well, when you read it aloud and you pay attention to punctuation, you begin to hear what your reader will hear in their mind. Punctuation matters. What does punctuation do in our writing? Punctuation gives us a sense of the nuance of what you're saying. Punctuation, in its various forms, communicates a number of things. A period tells you this thought stops here. This statement, this idea, this thought stops here. A comma, on the other hand, tells you this is not over. It's a visual sign that says pause. It gives you that split second to digest what's already been said before going on and building on that, adding on to it. You may remember talking about run-on sentences a couple of weeks ago. A run-on sentence is where you add clause after clause after clause after clause after clause. It's teenage girl speak. And it's full of commas, except that the teenage girls leave the commas out and they just run on. Well, you take a run-on sentence and it's full of commas. But what does that do? It tells you pause and add on, pause and add on, pause and add on. Better to break that into several sentences. But a comma tells you pause, there's more coming. A semicolon, there's a little more of a pause. What comes is specifically dependent on what preceded it. A colon is more formal still. Quotation marks tell us someone else said this, or we're doing this for emphasis. All of these things matter. Let me illustrate in a very simple statement. Maybe you've seen, and I'll try to send you the little meme that illustrates this. What does that sentence say? Let's eat grandma. That is vastly different from Let's eat. Grandma? One little comma makes all the difference in that statement. It completely changes the meaning. Clearly formed thoughts. Are we talking about cannibalism? Are we talking about sharing a meal? Expressing thoughts in clear, accurate, understandable words. Well, those are pretty clear and understandable. Plan what you're going to say. Let's eat, Grandma. Read what you wrote. Oh, no, I don't mean let's eat, Grandma. Rewrite what you wrote. Put that comma in. It matters. Okay. Good writing. Good writing takes the reader's thoughts to the heart of your thoughts as the writer. And it does it without letting superficial details, things that really don't matter, distract from the major theme or the major themes. There may be more than one. Remember, the purpose of writing something is to recreate in the reader's mind the image or the idea that existed in the writer's mind. We've mentioned this before, but let me again point you toward Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 4. The Apostle Paul, a Talmudic trained Jew, Pharisee of Pharisees, Hebrew of Hebrews, so on and so forth, writes as a converted Jew, now a Christian Jew, or a Jewish Christian, if you like, writes this letter to a congregation in what is modern Western Turkey, a congregation primarily made up of converted pagans, Gentiles, totally different background, totally different culture, totally different perspective on the world prior to their conversion to Christ. But these Gentiles are likewise Christians. And he says this in Ephesians 3 and verse 4, when you read this, meaning the letter to the Ephesians, you can perceive or understand my insight into the mystery of Christ. When you read this, you should understand what I understand. You should see what I see. In other words, when you read this, the image in your mind should be the image in my mind when I wrote it. Now, Robert Gunning points out in his book, The Technique of Clear Writing, that in general, you can define successful writers as those who have something to say and have learned to say it simply. I think we mentioned this last week. No writer ever gained a large audience by making his style more complicated than his thoughts required. Now, let's illustrate this. Where'd my eraser go? Don't eat, Grandma. Okay. Okay, here we go. So, most people will not read an article or a book or even a letter that makes them work to figure out each sentence. Do you enjoy working jigsaw puzzles? Some people do. Isn't it maddening when you get to the very end and you're missing a piece? Or you find a piece that looks like it ought to fit, but no matter which way you turn it, it doesn't fit. And you get to the very end and discover it's a piece from an entirely different puzzle that got put in the box where it didn't belong. That's the effect of making people work to figure out each sentence. Take that jigsaw puzzle, dump it out on the table. What's the first thing that you do with it? Well, if you're like my wife, the first thing you do is you spread all the pieces out and you turn them all over so that you can see the colors and the picture on each piece. Imagine turning all those pieces upside down so that all you can see is the brown cardboard back of the puzzle and trying to put it together that way. That's the effect of making people work to read what you wrote, making people work to understand what you write. It's interesting that far more people, now I realize that newspaper readership is declining at a precipitous pace. In fact, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of the major national newspapers this past year, basically stopped printing papers for the most part. You can still buy them from newsstands. You can still have an actual paper mailed to your house. Now, I don't know how they manage that. It's delivered same day. But most subscribers read the paper digitally. And that's true of most newspapers in the Western world nowadays. There's been a great deal of effort put into trying to make the digital product as much like the actual paper product as possible. But of course, you can't take your iPad and line the birdcage with it or something like that. But you also can't wrap fish in it, which is what the Brits used to do with newspapers. But far more people, even in the digital realm, read the comics, read the sports pages, read the ads. Classified ads have almost disappeared. But far more people read those parts of the newspaper than read the editorials and the main articles on the front page. If you look at the front page of a newspaper, what do you read? Now, I married Cinderella, which is to say, when my wife wakes up in the morning, the sun shines and the birds sing and it's a glorious day, and she comes out of bed ready to greet the day and embrace it and ready to go. And some moments later, I sort of stagger out of bed with one eye just barely open. And I don't really want to talk. I don't really want to. Just give me a cup of coffee and let me die in peace with my paper. And about an hour later, I'll be semi-conscious. That's the difference between us. I married Cinderella and she married Beauty's Beast. Well, I read the paper faithfully every morning. I look at the front page, and what do I look at? I do what 99% of readers do. I look at the headlines. If the headline doesn't grab my attention, I turn the page, or in my case, I swipe across the tablet. I'm not going to waste my time on something I'm not interested in. More people read the funnies, the sports page, even the ads, than the editorials or the main articles. The most popular magazines in the world. When I was a child, the most popular magazines in the world were magazines like Life and Look, and they've been out of print for many decades now. But their descendants, their children live on. People magazine is one of the most widely read magazines in the world. Why do people read it? Primarily because they don't have to read it. Popular magazines hold readers more effectively with pictures and short, clever captions than they do with brilliantly written articles. You will almost, I don't want to qualify it, you will almost never find brilliant writing, clear, accurate, incisive, pertinent writing in an episode of People magazine. What you will find is a bunch of mindless blather and gossip with beautiful photography. What that means for us, what that means for a gospel preacher, for a Bible class teacher, for a spiritually minded writer, is that if you want someone to read what you write, it needs to be vividly expressed in the simplest words, practical. Now, that fact that people won't read what challenges them, think about this. Isn't that one reason preachers now use PowerPoint? Isn't that one reason that when I was a young man, we used what I was taught to call rag sermons, that is, chart sermons on bed sheets to hold people's attention? Don't make your writer work. Don't. I think I said writer, your reader. Don't make your reader work just to understand you. Do try to write. So that a sixth grader can understand you. Simple words, simple sentences will serve for almost any subject. It doesn't matter how academic it is. It doesn't matter how technical it is. Simple words and simple sentences will serve for almost any subject. Charles Schulz, Sparky Schulz, as he was known to his family and friends, was the creator of the comic strip Peanuts. Peanuts, you may think of it as Charlie Brown or maybe Snoopy. Peanuts was his life's work, 50 years of daily cartoons, 4 panels or 5 panels a day, 10 on Sundays. And Charles Schulz addressed in a serious way all kinds of hard, serious subjects using Charlie Brown's first grade vocabulary. There was never a Peanuts panel written above first grade reading level, with the exception of a few words like psychiatrist for Lucy Van Pelt. Charles Schulz won hundreds of millions of loyal readers by doing that, by expressing things on a first grade level. Charles Schulz died 24 years ago, 2000. He retired from drawing Peanuts about 10 years before that, about 1990. 24 years after he died, his comic strip is still being reprinted and faithfully read by millions of readers every day in hundreds of newspapers around the world. What makes that so readable is that it offers its subject in small bites, just one or two ideas at a time. Just like a sermon, a sentence or a paragraph does not have to be eternal to be immortal. Sermon doesn't have to last forever. Okay. Clarity of purpose. Don't make your reader work just to understand what you're saying. Try to write so that an average kid, now, almost 50 years ago, when my teachers taught me write so that a sixth grader can understand, the average sixth grader read and understood on what today probably passes for a high school senior level. If you can make a modern sixth grader understand what you read, hold their attention, you're doing good. You're doing well. Okay. How do you prepare to write? Well, figure out what you want to say, plan it, write it, read what you've written, rewrite what you wrote. But let's go a little bit farther. To write effectively, I said plan your writing. How do you do that? Well, number one, to plan your writing, summarize your subject with one or two sentences. If it takes you more than two sentences to summarize what you're writing about, you need to back up and either narrow down your subject or reevaluate what you're writing about. If you can't explain it, you can't get to the gist of it in one or two sentences, you need to pare it down in some way. Describe what you intend to say. That's what this is. Describe. In fact, let's just do this. That's what a summary is, or a thesis statement, a topical statement. You're telling the reader what you intend to say, what you're going to talk about, what the image that you plan to create in their mind. Then, number two, list 2, 3, no more than 4 main points that you intend to present. Why no more than 4? I have some dear preacher friends whose sermon outlines run to 8, 9, 10, even 12 major points. And they're beautiful sermon outlines in the sense that there's lots and lots and lots of truth there. To my thinking, there are also 3 or 4 sermons in each one. Someone once asked one of my mentors, the late brother Johnny Ramsey, who, when I had the privilege of sitting at his feet, seldom ever preached more than about 21 or 22 minutes. Someone asked Brother Ramsey why he didn't preach longer sermons. Now, you have to understand that Brother Ramsey spoke, even though he was a native West Texan, he spoke about 3 times as fast as I can, routinely, especially when he was preaching. He was not a controversial preacher in one sense because his sermons were very, very hard for anyone to argue with. They were about 80% quotations of scripture. Brother Ramsey, why don't you preach longer sermons? And he replied, why should I? I'm giving you more information in 22 minutes than you can carry home in a bucket. And he wasn't kidding. I have a notebook of notes that I took on his sermons. And his average 20, 21, 22-minute sermon, average sermon, contained between 150 and 200 scriptures per sermon. That's a lot of scripture in a very short time. List the 2 or 3 or maybe 4 main, not mains, main points that you plan to make. Now, next to each point, add illustrations, supporting information, that relates to that point. Because you see, you want that information to support that point. Then summarize what your information shows or proves. That's different than the summary up here at the beginning. Here you're describing what you intend to say. Here you're showing what you've proven. Right? After that, point number 4, you conclude with a application or a call to action. And that's the here's how you use this information part of what you write. Here's what it does for you, to your reader. What impact should your words have on the person who's reading them? This is the process that your writing should follow, or the order that you're writing should follow. Describe what you intend to say. Let the reader know where you're going with this. Your topic statement or your thesis sentence tells the reader, here's why it's worth continuing to read. If you just jump straight into your main point, which is what the majority of newspaper writers seem to do nowadays, then most readers will never get past the headline. Tell them what you intend to say. Here's why you want to keep reading. Here are the points that you need to know. Here's the substance, the body of the information. Here's what it proves. Here's what you need to do with it. And I would write that down there, but I don't want to have to get down on my knees to write it that low on the board. But that fourth point comes down to, here's what you should do with it, good reader. Many writers find it very helpful to use a simple outline to assemble that information. I think I mentioned Barnes' basic outline. That's basically what this is. Introduction. That would be this part. The body or the text. That's this part. The summary. Summary of your article or your sermon or your book or your master's thesis or your doctoral dissertation, for that matter. A call to action. The application. Reader, this is what you ought to do with this. If you'll follow these simple steps, I can promise you that your writing will have more impact in a positive way. It will have more punch. It will be easier to read. Again, after you've written it, read it aloud. If it hurts your ears to hear it, I promise it will hurt the eyes of the reader who tries to read it until you rewrite it, until you simplify it and clarify it. Brother Moffitt used to teach us, cut it, cut it, cut it until it bleeds, cut it to the bone. And when you can't cut anymore, then you've got something worth reading. Okay. That's a good stopping point for our break. So we'll take about 15 minutes at this point. Okay. Now let's talk about clarity of expression. Talked about simple words and simple sentences, short, simple words and short, simple sentences a little bit ago. Choosing simple words is the most obvious key that a writer can use to express clearly what's in his mind. It's much easier under normal circumstances for a reader to see what the writer means when the characters or the actors in the story are the ones doing the things that the verbs describe. Placing the characters and their actions up front in the sentence, in the paragraph, that lets the reader know immediately who is doing and then what it is they're doing. information that describes, that explains, that qualifies in some way either the characters or their actions can usually follow the main information in a sentence. If you have your textbook, turn over to page, I'll have to find it now. Didn't think to mark it. Here we go. It would be in my edition, it's page, wait a minute. It's exercise 4.1, which in my edition is on page 70. Oh, it's on page 70 in the 6th edition. It may be 71, 72, or later in yours if you have a later edition. And I'm not going to go through all of the information here, but notice he makes the point, if you're having a hard time making the distinctions between important characters and what they're doing and so forth, it's probably because you're getting to know what you're writing, the sentences, too well. And he gives some examples. And the examples are what I want to draw your attention to. There were proposals put forth by student government for a decrease of student activity fees by the university. There were proposals put forth by student government for a decrease of student activity fees by the university. Okay, how can we simplify that? Student government proposed that the university decrease student activity fees. Oh, that's much clearer, isn't it? Student government made a proposal that the university institute a decrease in student activity fees. All three sentences say the same thing. Which one is most direct and why? If you look at the first one, student government is way over here past proposals. Well, what are we proposing? Who's doing the proposing? What's it about? Oh, the student government's doing it. What's it about? Well, you have to get almost to the end of the sentence before you find out that it's about activity fees for the university. In the third one, the who, student government, is right up front. And what they're doing, they're making a proposal. It's right there behind it. But what's the proposal all about? You have to get all the way to literally the end of the sentence to find out that it's about student activity fees. So you take the one in the middle, student government proposed that the university decrease student activity fees. And what do you have? You still have the object at the very end, the decrease in student activity fees. But you have the information organized so that who's doing something, what they're doing, and what it applies to falls in that order. It's a clear expression. Now, that exercise that follows that, several parts to it, relate to finding and relocating characters, or the who's doing what to whom part of the sentence. Now, putting things in order is the first part of this. So you want to put your actors and their actions in order. Simple, straightforward, logical order. There's not a hard and fast rule about this. It's simply a strategy for making it clear. Number two, we've talked about this before. use active verbs as much as possible. Well, why not just use active verbs all the time? Why not just eliminate passive verbs altogether? Because sometimes you need a passive verb. Passive verb forms are not incorrect, but they can obscure a simple image. They can make it more complicated to understand. Now, whenever the subject in your sentence is anonymous, or the identity of who's doing is irrelevant to what you're saying, then a passive verb is appropriate. It fits. But 9 times out of 10, if not 99 out of 100, an active verb, I did this, is much simpler, more direct, much clearer to the reader than this was done by me. Some years ago, a now departed brother in a previous congregation built for that congregation. I happened to be the preacher at the time. He built a beautiful, not ornate, but beautifully decorated lectern for the pulpit. Prior to that, in a nice new auditorium, we had a simple contact paper veneered pressed wood lectern from the office supply store, and it had been there for years, and it was fine. It was entirely adequate, but it didn't match the furnishings of the building. And so he had the resources, he had the skill, he had the tools. He built a beautiful matching style and color lectern to take the place of it. And the particle board one was relegated to a teenage classroom or something. And his daughter-in-law, on the inside of this lectern, painted in very fine little gold lettering that this was built by Paul Atkinson, summer of 2012, I think, something like that. In that scenario, the passive verb was built by, passive form, is appropriate. It was an inscription. It would have appeared awkward to the average reader to look inside that lectern and read, Paul Atkinson built this. It would almost smack up, look what I did. There are times when the passive form is appropriate, but they're not common. A third key for clear expression is what we call personalization. Personalize as much as you can. And I'm going to qualify that a little bit, as much as is practical. The reason I say that is that personalizing is not the same as writing in a familiar or a non-standard style. An action can be clearly described and yet fail to fully express what actually happened. To illustrate, it was concluded that the automobile should be purchased in lieu of obtaining a lease. Say what? I decided to buy the car instead of leasing it. What did we do? We personalized it. It was concluded that, no, I decided. That makes it much simpler and much clearer, doesn't it? Even abstractions, thoughts, ideas, emotions, even those can be the main characters in writing when they become the subjects of verbs that relate to them. Take your Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, for example. Paul does this in what is commonly called, really sort of mistakenly called, the love chapter of the Bible. And I say mistakenly because the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is actually chapters 12, 13, and 14 together. They, by rights, should be one chapter, the longest chapter in the New Testament, but that part's free and it won't be on the test. That's just something for you to think about. From the beginning of chapter 12 to the end of chapter 14, the subject is spiritual gifts. But in the middle of this, in chapter 13, what's Paul doing? He is doing what he said he would do in chapter 12, verse 31, part B. I will show you a more excellent way. The more excellent way is chapter 13, that is Christian love. So look at verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And here Paul illustrates how an abstraction, in this case, an idea, a concept, in some respects an emotion, can become the main character in this writing. Love is patient and kind. This is the English Standard Version. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. Then he goes on, in that context, those are miraculous things, miraculous knowledge, so forth. And he goes on and illustrates that as we proceed through the chapter. But what did he do here? He personalized a concept. He writes of love as a person. He anthropomorphized it almost. He didn't actually make it a person, but he wrote of it that way, attributed to it these qualities. In that section of scripture, love does all these things. It prophesies. In this passage, love itself, prophecies, tongues, knowledge, they're all impersonal concepts. And yet Paul animates all of them. That's what personalization is. It's animating something, giving it life. Paul animates them by making these concepts the subjects of the verbs that describe how they impact us. You can do the same thing in your writing. And done well, it will make your writing vivid. It will make your writing reach out and grab the reader's attention. Now, sometimes complex ideas may require complicated words and a very specific and complex, if not downright complicated way of expressing them. Legal documents are a prime example of this. You remember a couple of weeks ago, I made mention of the use of and/or and said, don't use that in your writing because that is a legal construction. It's only appropriate in legal documents because it has a very specific meaning. However, even in those situations where complex ideas require complex words and complex or even complicated ways of expressing them, even in those situations, these basic principles of clear expression will make it much easier for a reader to see and understand what they read. Now, you may have been busy working today. The day that this is being recorded is February the 8th, 2024. And this morning in Washington, D.C., at the Supreme Court, a challenge to the candidacy of Donald Trump was brought before the Supreme Court. The state of Colorado, Supreme Court in the state of Colorado had ruled that Mr. Trump's name should not be allowed on the Colorado ballot for the upcoming primary for presidential candidates because supposedly he was guilty of insurrection. And the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the insurrection clause, as it's called, prohibits such. So arguments were heard back and forth, and I happened to listen to part of that as I was going about my daily activities this morning, and it was fascinating to listen as the lawyers for each side tried to make their case, tried to bring in examples and illustrations and precedents. And what was fascinating about it was the justices of the Supreme Court were having none of this nonsense from either side. This attorney or that attorney would present this and this and this and this point, and Justice Kagan or Justice Jackson or Justice Alito would speak up and take what they had said and just break it down into the simplest of terms and say, so you're saying this. And the attorney would back up, well, yes, but this and that and this and that and that. But that leads to this. And they would state very simply, very directly. It was fascinating to listen to because it's exactly what we're talking about in expressing things clearly in our writing. Break it down. Even when it's complex, it doesn't have to be complicated for the reader. It makes it easier for the reader to see and understand when you simplify. Okay, let me put 3 words on the board. And then we'll talk about those things. And then we'll go to William's book. I want to note a few things there before we're done. So, with respect to clarity of expression, there are 3 words that you need to understand. Word number 1 is the word concision. Now, this is not a word that you use in the English language in the 21st century very frequently, unless you're either a grammarian or possibly, well, probably not even if you're a Jew. If you are a student of the King James Version, you will find this word in the New Testament, Paul talking about those of the concision. And in that context, Paul is actually writing about Jews and Jewish Christians who were trying to hold on to aspects of the law in addition to Christ. In grammar, by the way, this is the root of the word circumcision, which means to cut off. Well, concision in grammar means getting rid of excess words. Getting rid of excess words, or alternatively, let me just do it this way. Unnecessary words. In this context, excess words is unnecessary words. The literal meaning of concision is to cut off. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, Paul uses this actual word in the King James translation. Of course, everybody knows Paul wrote in King James English, right? Seriously. He uses this word, concision, to describe those Jews, or those Judaizers perhaps, as the cutters off, the mutilators, the ones who would cut off others from fellowship with God to maintain their preferences. One of the simplest ways to get rid of excess words, going back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, is to use simple, active voice verbs instead of more complex passive constructions. What do I mean? Concision. I wrote this. Versus this was written by me. Both sentences say the same thing. No, they don't. Both convey the same thought. This is clear, simple, concise. This is not. Good examples of unnecessary words would be trite and redundant expressions. We've talked about those in some of the non-standard and slang and words that we begin each class with. Each and every, full and complete, separate and apart, first and foremost. Well, which is it? Is it each one or is it every one? What's the difference? It's a difference without a distinction. Is it full or is it complete? No distinction between the two. Is it the first or is it the foremost? The foremost is not quite as common a word in the 21st century, but it's redundant. It's like saying the first and the first, each and each. We can also get rid of meaningless words. And these are not words with no meaning. They are words that are used as useless filler. Kind of. Well, it's kind of like, it's sort of like. Think about this for a moment. Here's a marker. It's kind of like this marker. This one's black, this one's green. No. Either it's like or it's not. Now, it can be like in some respects. These are both markers. They're both made of plastic. They're both erasable. They both have caps. The caps attached to the bases of the markers. In all of these respects, they're like. This one's black, this one's green. They're unlike or not like in that single respect. But they're not sort of like, they're not kind of like. They're either like or they're not. It depends on what characteristic you're comparing. Actually. What does the word actually mean? Actually means it really happened, or it really exists, or it is a fact. is actually necessary, not usually. Actually is an adverb. It qualifies a verb. It actually happened. Well, we might add the word actually for emphasis. But in normal writing, we don't need to emphasize that fact. It happened. Now, if you were trying to emphasize something, you might say, he actually said that. But that doesn't change whether or not it occurred. He said that. This is a matter of record. There's my wife. Basically. Well, basically, this is what he's saying. Here's what he's saying. It's a filler word. Virtually, practically. None of these are bad words. All of them have appropriate uses. Most of the time, they're not necessary. Most of the time, these words add nothing to what you're saying. Perhaps the most misused example of this kind of word, and I'm going to pick on Generation Z here a little bit, and the folks just before that, the millennials, would be the word literally. I just literally died. How are you speaking to me? These are words that more frequently than not can be deleted without changing the meaning of the sentence even a little bit. Now, there are also phrases, commonly used phrases that can be replaced with single words. Well, I couldn't come to class due to the fact that I was sick. I couldn't come to class because I was sick. Concerning the matter of your class attendance, what are we talking about? We're talking about your class attendance. Well, now this product has the ability to do this, do that. Has the ability to means what? It can. Why not just say it can? It can do this, it can do that. Concision means getting rid of unnecessary words, words you don't need, words that are excess, words that do nothing but take up space on the page and in the reader's mind. I will tell you this. Academic writing is notoriously not concise. I graded a term paper from the last semester in a different class, not in this class. That was clearly written by a modern academic writer, because the good lady said in 13 pages what she could have said in about 2.5 had she simplified her writing. She did not make an A on her paper. Word number 2 is the word cohesion. Cohesion. To cohere. And that word simply means sticks together. Your writing should stick together. This word, cohesion, describes how the sentences in a paragraph and the paragraphs in an article or a research paper connect to one another and flow in a clear direction. In your writing, you're trying to take your writer from point A through point B and point C to point D, which is your conclusion. And then you want to move from your conclusion, point D, to point E, which is your application or your call to action. These same points apply to sermon outlining as well, for that matter. So those of you who plan to preach or to preparing Bible class material, those of you who plan to teach, same principles apply for spoken articles as for written. Things that hang together, they connect to one another in order to flow in a clear direction. Every sentence in a paragraph should connect to the one before it or to the one after it, if it happens to be the first one. Every paragraph should have a logical sequence of sentences that move the reader from seeing a single image to seeing a complete picture. Yellow sunshine. There's a single image. Yellow sunshine in a blue sky. Yellow sunshine in a blue sky with white clouds. Yellow sunshine in a blue sky with white clouds over green fields and majestic purple mountains. Yellow sun in a blue sky with white clouds over green fields with majestic purple mountains lined by amber waves of grain. What have I done? Made a mockery of our national anthem, basically, or actually America the Beautiful, not our national anthem. Thank goodness. I guess I'm not guilty of some offense. Here's the point. Each sentence should move the reader from that single image, yellow sunshine, to the complete picture at the end of the paragraph. Cohesion means that all of these thoughts, individual thoughts expressed by each sentence, connect together in a logical way. Word number 3. And it's related. Concision, cohesion. Someday I'll learn to write. Coherence. Y'all forgive me. I can't write and speak at the same time. Coherence. And that word means sticks together in order. Get rid of unnecessary words. Arrange your words so that they stick together in order. Logical development of thought. Coherence is focus. The orderly progression of ideas that move the reader from a basic idea through the facts that perfect that idea to a conclusion or a course of action. That's what this clarity of expression is all about. Okay. Now, let's go to the text. And in my copy of William's book, we're on page 41, chapter 3, actions. Clarity number 1, actions. William Shakespeare in Hamlet makes the point, suit the action to the word to the action. This has to do with word choice and how words interact with each other. You get to choose your words. Ain't life grand? You get to choose your words. We have a vocabulary in the English language that is unrivaled by any other language on earth. We have enough words in the English language that we can express what we want to say, what we want a reader to understand so clearly that there's no excuse to not do so. We talk about direct, clear, concise writing. That stands in contrast to writing that's awkward, that's muddy, that's confusing, that's obscure, that's disjointed, and several other words that I won't bother with, turgid and so forth. I want you to read with me the examples that Williams offers to make exactly this point. 1A, the cause of our educational system's failure at teaching basic skills to children is not understanding the influence of their cultural background on learning. What? The cause of our educational system's failure at teaching basic skills of children is not understanding the influence of their cultural background on learning. Whose cultural background? Who's learning? Contrast that with example 1B. Our educational system has failed to teach children basic skills because we do not understand how their cultural background influences the way they learn. The first one is muddy, complex, and unclear. You could read it 3 or 4 times and probably figure out precisely what's being said. If you're an apt reader, you probably understood the general idea the first time through. But the second example, our educational system has failed to teach children basic skills because we do not understand how their cultural background influences the way they learn. That's a fairly lengthy sentence, but you can't make it much simpler, much clearer than that. What's the difference between the two? Concision. The second one gets rid of unnecessary words, passive verb forms, and so forth. Cohesion. The thoughts stick together. There's no Well, now wait a minute. Whose cultural background are we talking about? The educational system or the children or some unnamed person? Coherence. The thoughts, the words stick together in order. It makes sense the first time through with no questions asked as far as understanding what's being said. Now, go on and read just a little bit. Williams makes the point that we look at that first example and call it unclear, not because anything in the sentence itself is unclear, but because our understanding is unclear. We're describing how it makes us feel. I'm not sure what's what in that sentence. We have a hard time or a harder time, or maybe simply more difficulty understanding it. That's what unclear means. It's harder to understand. How your reader judges what you write determines whether or not what you write has the desired effect. In preaching and teaching the gospel of Christ, we're trying to move people in their relationship with God. Many a preacher, myself included, has come to the end of sermon after sermon, explained from the biblical text as best we're able, with illustrations and examples, explanations and understanding of this topic or that topic, how our listeners, or when it's in a bulletin article or Bible class material, how our readers should respond to the information that we're providing, offered then a call to action. We usually call it the invitation at the end of the sermon. We try to relate what we've been talking about to that appeal to the non-Christian to become a Christian, to the unfaithful Christian to be restored, to the struggling Christian to reach out for help. We stand together. We, in this country, typically sing an invitation song, a song of encouragement intended to give an emotionally comfortable situation where someone can come forward and say, I need to whatever, only to come to the end of the last verse of the song without any response. And if you do this week after week, month after month, year in and year out, you will have times that you wonder, am I not making this clear? How could I make this clearer? How can I make this move those who read what I'm writing or those who hear what I am saying to take the action that I'm encouraging them to take? Is there something wrong with what I'm saying or how I'm saying it or what I'm writing, how I'm writing it? What we have to factor into that is that the response, whether it's to a spoken sermon or to a written lesson, the response is always ultimately on the shoulders of the reader or the hearer, not the writer or the speaker. We do everything that we're able. We try to get rid of excess baggage so that the message is clear. We try to arrange it so that it sticks together in order. We try to write and speak with concision, with cohesion, with coherence, because we're trying to move men to Jesus. We don't need to try to impress them with our vocabulary. We don't need to try to awe them with the sound of scholarship. As the hymn we sometimes sing says, we need to make the message plain. And that's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. Making the message plain. Now, as we go on in Williams, he talks about telling stories about characters and actions. And this certainly would have appeal or application to simply telling or writing stories. Aesop's fables have all of these qualities. That's why they have lasted for almost 3,000 years in literature. Every story needs characters and actions. But what are you going to do with them? And it doesn't matter if you're writing about Little Red Riding Hood, and that's the example that Williams uses, and I like that just because it's vivid. Once upon a time, there was Little Red Riding Hood, Grandma, the Woodsman, and the Wolf. The end. That's all the characters. But what happened? No action. They were. They existed. That's all there was to it. Once upon a time, as a walk through the woods was taking place, a jump out from behind a tree occurred, causing fright. You've got all the actions. Well, most of the actions. But who did them? Put them together. And what do you get? Well, it depends on how you put them together. And that's example 2C and example 2D in contrast. Once upon a time, as a walk through the woods was taking place on the part of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf's jump out from behind a tree occurred, causing fright in Little Red Riding Hood. Wow. That's just about the definition of turgid. You've got action, you've got characters, but how many more paragraphs of that how many more sentences of that would you read? You'd never get to the big bad wolf meeting the woodsman. He'd never even come into the picture there. You wouldn't read that far. Once upon a time, Little Red Riding Hood was walking through the woods when the wolf jumped out from behind a tree and frightened her. Oh. Now you've got characters and action without all this excess business. It sticks together in order and it makes sense and it holds your attention because it makes sense. You can see the picture. All the characteristics, the characters and the actions are developed in order in your mind so that when you get to the end of the sentence, you see the picture. Little Red Riding Hood, terrified because the big bad wolf has jumped out from behind the tree in the forest as she was walking innocently alone. You respond differently to each sentence because even though they tell the same story, they tell it in different ways. People respond differently to what you write based on how you express it. Now, Williams goes on and talks about how the different parts of the sentence interact with each other. Characters as subjects. Once upon a time, as a walk through the woods, there's your subject in this particular sentence, was taking place. There's your first verb, but it's a passive verb. On the part of Little Red Riding Hood, there's your main character, but your main character is not the subject of the sentence here. It's not in the proper place to be the subject of the sentence. The wolves, there's another main character, jump from behind a tree. There's another action that's a subject. Causing fright in Little Red Riding Hood, but put the pieces of the puzzle in place in order. Go back to the example of a jigsaw puzzle. You open the box, you dump out the parts, you turn them all over so that you see all the colored pieces, not the plain brown back. Then what do you do? If you are a puzzle master, at least according to my wife, and she's the authority, you look for all of the pieces that have a straight edge, because those are the border pieces. Those are the edge of the puzzle. And you put those pieces together, you figure out how they fit until you have a complete square. Now you have the boundaries of the puzzle. That means everything else goes inside, and you can work from the outside to the in. That's what we're doing with our words when we write. We're building a framework so that as the reader progresses through what we write, they see more and more of the picture in focus until they see the entire picture. Now, come on down to page 44, at least in the 6th edition, to the section that says actions as verbs. And that gets to how you use your verbs. And the comparison basically is of passive versus active verbs. And the point. Notice the little highlighted section that says, here's the point. Always read the sidebars in a textbook. The most important information is usually there. In this case, here's the point. In the version of Little Red Riding Hood that seems indirect and confusing, we do not see the main characters and the subjects, nor do we see in the verbs the actions that those characters are connected with. Thus, the structure of the story does not match the structure of the sentence. Take your highlighter and highlight that last part. The structure of the story does not match the structure of the sentence. There's the problem. When you write, make the structure of your sentence and your story or your topic match. Make them support each other. On the other hand, in the version we thought was clearer and more direct, we do see the main characters in the subjects. We do see the main actions in the verbs. In that version, the structure of the story does match the structure of the sentence. So here are the first two principles of good storytelling or good writing. Express main characters or topics as subjects. Express their actions as verbs. Well, what does academic writing have to do with fairy tales? Everything. Good writing shares the same characteristics, whether we're talking about Little Red Riding Hood or a doctoral dissertation. A very wise man once commented in my hearing that he did not have to have a PhD in a particular field. And this man did have a PhD. But he said, I don't have to have a PhD in a particular field to know if another man knows what he's talking about. All I have to do is listen to how he describes it. He was making the point that someone who knows their subject, who really knows their subject, can express it, can describe it so that anyone can understand it, at least on a rudimentary level. An individual who can't speak or write about a subject on a sixth grade level does not really understand their subject. Now, I want to cover a couple of other things, and these are just brief. If you're in the book, flip over to about page 60, 61. You should find a section that is labeled useful nominalizations, and that's a $10 word that refers to how we use verbs. Nominalizations. Well, go back to pages 48 and 49 for a minute. That's where Williams actually explains what he means by nominalizations. Nominalizations are basically verbs or adjectives or adverbs that are used as nouns. Now, a verb being used as a noun specifically is called a gerund. And if you're having flashbacks to 8th grade grammar and getting all shaky, that's all right. That won't be on the test. But we use verbs as nouns sometimes because it makes the meaning clear. When you discover something, you've made a discovery. Discover is a verb. Discovery is a noun. When you resist something, that action is resistance, the action of resistance. That's a noun. Resisting is the verb. When you react, that's the verb. A reaction is the noun. Well, what are we doing? We're taking verbs, in this case, and making them, using them as nouns. That's one form of nominalization. Those are all gerunds. But you can do the same thing with adjectives and adverbs. Careless. If you are careless, well, that's describing a quality. You are, there's your verb, to be, are. Careless, that's a description of how you are. Carelessness, that's the noun. Different, that's a description. It's not like. Difference, that's the noun. It describes that quality of being not like. It refers to that quality of being not like. And so on and so forth. Now he makes the point, sometimes nominalizations, the way that you use the verb as a noun or the adjective or the adverb as a noun, the form it takes is the same. Hope is a verb. Hope is also a noun. We hope for eternal life. We have a living hope. Other examples, request and so forth. I'm not going to go through the illustrations that Williams gives here, but I would encourage you to just read over them because it will sharpen your attention to such things. Now flip over to page 61 for just a moment, and let's wind up with this section about nominalizations, about using adjectives and adverbs and verbs as nouns. The fact of the matter is people overuse nominalizations. Take a listen. If you watch or listen to network news, network opinion shows, talk radio, you will hear, take a listen as an introduction to some snippet or clip. I'll tell you candidly, it drives me nuts. There's a good use of a word like bug. It makes me nuts, makes me crazy. Words that have more than one meaning. I am not a pecan. Because it is trite and worn out and overused, and it is an improper nominalization at that. But the fact of the matter is, you can't express yourself clearly simply without sometimes using nominalizations. There on page 61, under the section Useful Nominalizations, Williams gives some examples. These arguments all depended on a single unproven claim. Well, argument is the nominalization of a verb, argue. This decision, the nominalization of a verb, decide. They link one sentence to another. Those are words that express express in a summary way what was described in more detail previously, the argument or the decision. What they do, what a nominalization does, is it lets us condense into a single understandable word an idea that, if you expressed it in its proper form, would very quickly become awkward. Think of nominalizations as being a little bit like pronouns. Now, sitting in front of me is a student. This student is a good student. This student is a handsome student. This student is a grown student. This student is a male student. Wouldn't it be simpler to say, there's a student in front of me. He is a good student. He's grown. I don't even have to tell you he's a man, because he tells you that. That's not a nominalization, that's a pronoun. It takes the place of something proper, but that would get awkward very quickly. A nominalization does basically the same thing in practice. It names, represents an awkward fact. It names what would be the object of a verb. At the end of a sentence, it introduces a topic that you're going to explain or detail or develop in the following sentence, whether it's an argument or a decision or a question. All of that to say this: there are rules to English grammar. The rules of grammar exist for a reason. Using gerunds, using nominalizations, using adjectives, adverbs, verbs as nouns. These are not examples of, oh, rules were made to be broken. No, they're examples of rules are not ironclad in English. Rules are flexible, even in academic writing. There's no reason that where all this leads is this, and I'll leave you with this. We'll end a few minutes early. I'll leave you with this thought. There's no reason for your writing to ever be awkward or stilted, no matter what the topic, no matter how complex or complicated it may be. There's no reason for your writing or your speech to ever be awkward or stilted. You can express even the most complex, complicated ideas in simple, direct terms if you will work at it. Concision, cohesion, coherence. Get rid of the excess baggage, make what's left stick together in order, and folks will read all the way to the end of what you write. And then they'll come tell you how good it was. We'll stop there. Next week, we'll be talking about outlining for sermons and Bible classes and things like that. If memory serves me, let me double check the syllabus. Make sure I get this in order. Yes, basics of outlining next week. And we'll talk about academic formats a little bit more, perhaps. Let me stop the recording here.